So yeah, tonight is going to follow up on last month's topic, which was kind of the assess and plan side of teaching. We'll be into the implementation and reflection side of things. Yeah, welcome to the September Master Talk. This is our Wednesday night Alpine. It is September 3rd. And my name is Chris Rogers. I am a PSIA-AASI snowboard national team member. Most of you that know me or have been on Zoom calls with me before know me more for the snowboard side. I'm based out of Vail Mountain, and this topic is being recorded. As such, there won't be much opportunity for discussion and interaction during this call because it's recorded and we don't want to have to edit those out. There will be some time at the end for question and answer. So I do encourage you to get out a notepad or just notes on your computer and make some notes. We'll have some time to discuss at the end, but that way they can kind of trim that out and just post the recording. I do want to mention that these talks are named Master Talks in honor of Ron LeMaster, who is a close friend and mentor to many of us in the industry. And I just think it's really cool that they, it's not just a Master Talk; it is a Master Talk in honor of Ron LeMaster. And I just wanted to reference that. Like I said, tonight's topic will be implementation and reflection. I am a member of the PSIA-AASI national team. I teach here at Vail Mountain. I've previously taught in Steamboat. I've taught in Alaska, where I grew up, and I've spent a number of seasons teaching in New Zealand. I'm an examiner in the Rocky Mountain region for snowboard, for freestyle specialist, and for children's specialist. In addition to those hats, I am on the national task force for the snowboard all regions national task force working on the alignment project, and I'm on the teaching task force, which is cross-discipline, building the teaching process. And I think that last hat that I wear is probably the reason they asked me if I could fill in when none of the regular group leaders were available tonight. I do always like to put the caveat out that I am mostly fluent in Alpine. I do have my level 2 Alpine. I'm working on my level 3, and I grew up ski racing before I started snowboarding. I teach about 30% of my season on those double boards. So most of you are probably better skiers than me. Many of you teach quite a bit more than I do. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and the question and answer time at the end, and we'll get into some more of those kind of intricacies of things as we go. But the main reason I'm here to help clarify this implementation reflection piece is for the last 10 years, I've been involved in the teaching task force and working discipline agnostic, looking at what is great teaching and how do we then measure that in the certification world. One more plug for the clinic roster. If it's easier, you can throw your QR code reader up there for that. And I'll post it in the chat here another time right now as well. So you guys are hopefully all familiar with this picture by now, the learning connection model. We will be focusing on that bottom left corner, the teaching skills side of the learning connection model. And looking at that specifically as we get into things, recognizing that there's also quite a bit of people skills going on during our teaching skills assessment, during our level 1, level 2, and level 3, kind of defining those as the direct connection between two people, between the teacher and the student. Those are kind of that people skills bucket. And the connection between the teacher and the student to the learning environment or to learning, that's going to be that teaching skills, maybe learning skills, but that's kind of the side we're focused on. Yeah, there's a lot of interplay that goes on here between the teacher and the student that might be better buckets for people skills. And those are a whole different set of assessment criteria we're not really looking at tonight in terms of framing up the implementation and reflect and review segments of our learning outcomes for teaching skills. So several years back at the Interski in Ushuaia, the national team presented the learning connection model for the first time on a global stage. And it was really framed under the idea of the question of what makes a great ski instructor. And in Ushuaia, it was still heavily focused on the technical skills. In the time since Ushuaia, there's been a lot more time put into what makes a great teacher in terms of the teaching skill and what makes great teachers in terms of the people skills. This is what the national groups ended up with as the fundamentals for teaching skills. Collaborate on long-term goals and short-term objectives, manage information, activities, terrain selection, and pacing, promote play, experimentation, and exploration, facilitate the learner's ability to reflect upon experiences and sensations, adapt to the changing needs of the learner, and manage emotional and physical risk. That idea of the fundamentals, just like our technical skills fundamentals, these being the underpinnings, the framework of what makes great teaching, these are all happening. And then those get translated into learning outcomes and assessment criteria. The language of academia, right? The work done over the last decade to kind of parlay everything that we do in PSIA-AASI into a framework that makes sense in terms of curriculum, in terms of education. And this is from the level 2 assessment form. Most of the things that I'll reference tonight are built out of the level 2 assessment criteria and learning outcomes. Learning outcome being the overarching statement about what a candidate, how a candidate should interpret or should be able to show their learning of those fundamentals at a specific level. So where the fundamentals are the same across all levels, we then step those up with learning outcomes. So assess and plan, implement, and I pasted implement in there twice, but we've got them in there later. Last month, you spent time in the assess and plan side of things, and we're going to focus on implement and reflect and review, but also recognizing that good teaching is cyclical. We'll come back to this assess and plan portion of things as we work through tonight, and as we work on becoming better instructors. We're always going to come back to this. So even though for the purpose of these summer calls, it was split into Master Talk last month on assess and plan, and this month on implement and reflect and review, we're going to be talking about it all because it is all cyclical. So our goal here is to connect the concepts from our teaching skills assessment directly to the concrete reality of what we do every day as instructors. How does this implement and reflection play out in our day-to-day lessons? How do we take those skills that we build in our day-to-day lessons and apply that to the learning outcomes around implementation and reflection? This is all about bringing that plan to life. Assess and plan, we make a plan, we make some short-term goals, some short-term objectives and some long-term goals with our students. Implement reflection is how we put that into play, and how do we build from that? How do we anchor that learning and help our students actually evolve as skiers? But why focus on implement and reflect and review? Implement is where your plan comes to life. It's the action-oriented part of your teaching. Reflect and review is where the learning solidifies. It turns a good lesson into a great one by creating lasting change. And excelling with implement and reflect and review demonstrates your ability to create a student-centered, adaptive, and effective learning environment. So we're going to start with this implement learning outcome. Facilitate learning experiences and adapts them as necessary to guide students towards agreed upon outcomes and engage them in the process. I do want to add a little preamble here. This is probably new information for most people. The learning outcomes and assessment criteria are something that the National Teaching Task Force is reviewing right now, and there are some recommendations in terms of changes moving forward. These are the current learning outcomes and assessment criteria, what I have in this presentation. We don't know if the new language is going to be adopted for this season or for next season. It's part of the 2026 alignment project. So the proposed changes would come into play in April of 2026 officially. There are some regions that may adopt the new language for this winter. What I do want to say with that, and I bring that up not to add confusion, but just to tell you there is a roadmap, and the goal was to make things a little bit more concise, to make them a little bit more clear, and to reduce some of the redundancy across learning outcomes and assessment criteria. The learning outcomes will stay the same. What may change is going from 3 down to 2 assessment criteria. So there's been some revision to those. We're going to be using the existing assessment criteria here, but if you get into the season in your region and the assessment form looks a little different, that's why there is this roadmap towards some different language. But we're working from the language that we have currently published. This is what you would see on the assessment forms right now. So the learning outcome being that overall statement, and then we've got 3 assessment criteria here: adapt, descriptions, demos, and feedback, and manage risk. And we're going to dive into each one of these just to make sure we're all working from a common language perspective. So adapt the learning environment. The official learning outcome is adapt the learning environment to align with the needs of the group. And this can take a lot of different elements. And throughout this presentation tonight, what I want you to think about anytime we're looking at one of these assessment criteria is I want you thinking about a real lesson that you taught last winter. And how did these elements play out? How are you choosing terrain to align with a group's need? How are you managing the pace and flow of the lesson? How are you adjusting to changing weather or snow conditions? And how are you modifying drills based on student performance? These are all different areas where adapt comes into play. It's not just about picking the right trail. It's about creating a classroom on snow is what we do, right? Creating a classroom and modifying and tailoring that environment. Are your students getting tired? Maybe it's time for a less demanding drill. Are they looking bored? Maybe it's time for a more demanding drill. Is the run getting crowded? Maybe we need to move to a zone with less traffic or change our drill based on the traffic on the mountain. And this plays in the assessment environment in terms of your terrain selection, in terms of choosing appropriate drills and based on the terrain you have available, right? We all know that when we're in an exam environment, we kind of have what's there in front of us. It may not be the terrain that we're used to teaching on. It may not be our ideal lesson environment. If I was back at my home mountain, I'd be over on this trail over here for that. We all know that there are those scenarios. So how do we adapt? How do we work with what we have in front of us? Just like in a real lesson where weather might change or the guest is getting tired or there's a run that you would normally use that was closed. We're going to adapt our learning environment to align with the needs of the group. Assessment criteria 2, descriptions, demos, and feedback. The language of the assessment criteria is provide clear and relevant information, which in parentheses is descriptions, demos, and feedback that encourages learning. Elements like simple, concise, and accurate descriptions, visually clear, accurate, and relevant demonstrations, and providing timely, specific, and actionable feedback. Clarity and relevance is really important here. Is your explanation easy to understand? Is your demo something the student can see and relate what you're doing to make movements themselves? Is your feedback clear? Is it relevant? Is it timely? Is it something they can act on? Is it, hey, let's do that again? Or is it, I noticed your skis were getting a little wider as you move through that turn. Let's try to keep them a little bit more close together on that next attempt. I can't tell you the number of times I've watched candidates at an exam explain a task and then explain it again, and then check for understanding, and just for good measure, explain it again. And when you think about the scarcity of time in an exam scenario, one of the most important things that we can practice is being clear and concise with what we're describing. If you're describing it over and over and over again, you are starting to skew the timing of your lesson towards talking over action. And so being really aware of descriptions, demos, and feedback and the amount of time that those things take, but also being aware of these three elements are one of three assessment criteria, right? Those are all lumped into assessment criteria 2 under implement. And those are 3 assessment criteria out of 9 total you're being evaluated on. And so how much time are you dedicating to feedback versus all of the other elements of creating, assessing and planning with your students, creating and implementing your lesson plan, reflecting and reviewing on that content? And I think sometimes people see this word feedback under provide clear and relevant information and feel like they have to give individualized verbal feedback to every person in their lesson in the lesson assessment for each activity. So think about other ways that we can give feedback. We can give feedback intrinsically by giving them something to be aware of. Thinking about, on this next run, I really want you to feel your shins against the front of your boots. Now at the bottom of that run, feedback could simply be, what did you feel in your boots? What was different this time than last run? Open questions, but getting them to answer those questions versus you saying, hey, Alan, in the start of this turn, and going into individualized feedback. And so really taking a second on this assessment criteria in particular to say that's a lot of information grouped into one assessment criteria, and it's really easy to overemphasize this assessment criteria in our implement piece of it. And I think if each of you reflect on times that you've been the learner, some of us are visual learners, some of us are auditory, have a preference for auditory information, some of us have a preference for kinesthetic. You look at learning styles, we could talk about the watcher, thinker, feeler, and doer, and people might connect with some of those more than others. But most of us at a root level have to actually do something before we're going to start to learn it. We might need to think about it first and then go do it. We might need to see some demos and then go do it. We might want to hear that auditory explanation or know some of the sensations or some of the auditory cues we might hear. We might want to know about what our skis are going to sound like. Those are all real things. But in order to learn it, we still have to go do it, right? Skiing and snowboarding and all of these other, most sports are tactile environments. We have to actually go do them to start to anchor that learning. And so if we are spending too much time on descriptions, demos, and feedback, we're taking away from our ability to create time, practice time, which is sitting down in the reflect and review, and we'll get to that in a second. But thinking about how do we keep this lesson moving? And it's one of the biggest pitfalls I see as an examiner is too much time being spent on this assessment criteria. Descriptions are important. Setting up the task that you want your students to do, super important. Demos, being able to give that clear visual picture, super important. And feedback, giving cues, giving things to work on, super important. But we don't want to overemphasize that or spend too much time there because it'll detract from the rest of the time we have available in that short 25 to 30-minute teach. So hitting on that piece, all of these are important, simple, concise, and accurate description, visually clear, accurate, and relevant demonstrations, and timely, specific, and actionable feedback, all super important, but keep that framed within your overall time of your lesson and all of the other elements we want to show to demonstrate great teaching. Assessment criteria 3 under implement is manage physical and emotional risks effectively, choose safe stopping points and manage speed, create supportive learning atmospheres for students, promote engagement, and celebrating small victories. These are small things that you can do that add up to this idea of manage physical and emotional risk to promote engagement in the learning environment. This is all about, whether it's the slope safety code, whether if you're maybe going into the park, it might be under Park Smart or Smart Style, important elements, teaching the rules of the road per se, but it's also a lot bigger than that. It's how are your students feeling? I'm sure we've all been in the scenario where we've gotten on terrain that maybe over-terrained our students a little bit. And you start to see them take a little step back. You see some gears turning cognitively, maybe a little glazing in their eyes, a little bit of fear showing up. We've all done it accidentally. This is what we're looking at in under assessment criteria 3, manage risk. We're looking at how does that detract from or add to the learning environment? And again, it's walking that little bit of a knife edge. If we're being too safe, if we're not creating any risk, they might not be learning. If we are applying too much, if we're creating too much of a scenario where there's too much risk, we might be detracting from the learning environment. And so it's this constant balance of managing risk, not avoiding risk. We are in an inherently risky sport. There is risk involved in what we do. Our job is to try to manage that to a degree where they can learn. Under the reflect and review learning outcome, moving to the next learning outcome, helps students recognize, reflect upon, and assess experiences to apply understanding and performance changes to desired outcomes. This is where we get to explore, experiment, and play, which is pace learning activities to allow students reflection time as they explore, experiment, and/or play towards desired outcomes. Describe change, help students recognize and understand change in performance relative to outcomes. And relate change, help students apply gained skills to riding and skiing situations. So again, we'll dive into each of those. This is really about helping our students become their own coaches and understanding what they're doing, giving them the practice time and giving them time to anchor. Assessment criteria 1, pace learning activities to allow students reflection time as they explore, experiment, and/or play towards desired outcomes. And if I were to pick one assessment criteria to say this is the most important assessment criteria, it would be this one. This is where, again, going back to that, descriptions, demos, and feedback. I think a common pitfall in exams is more time tailored to that assessment criteria and not enough time tailored to this assessment criteria. Building mileage and practice time into the lesson, giving students space to figure things out independently, avoiding paralysis by analysis to promote action, and using playful tasks or challenges to reinforce skills. This is what, in my mind, separates a good instructor from a great instructor. Is a great instructor knows how to manipulate the environment, the time that they have available to continue to reinforce skills within the learning environment in different ways. So you've given them an opportunity to practice, and then we're going back and we're addressing those skills or those drills again, but in another way. We're experimenting with it. We're giving the students some indirect teaching styles, some guided discovery, some problem solving, some exploration. We're going to continue that learning environment, but it's not just, okay, let's ski this pitch. Now let's talk about it. Let's ski this pitch. Let's talk about it. Let's ski this pitch. How do we go back and reinforce that learning through the student's time to reflect? And that student's reflection happens by them doing it, and then maybe some thoughtful questions, maybe some prompting. We want to give them opportunity, give them mileage. As you're looking at this in the lens of a on-snow assessment, think about trying not to stop where you can still see the place that you started. All that's regularly in exams. Okay, we're going to ski from here 50 feet down, and the students may be going to get 2 or 3 turns, and then we're going to stop and talk about it. Versus, let's do that drill. Maybe I'm going to stop 50 feet down so I can watch, but I want you guys to go all the way down to that sight line way down there. And so giving that exploration, that practice time. And that's going to be a little bit different resort to resort, and, depending on where an assessment's located, what your total available terrain is. Some exams, some regions, you may have the option to use multiple lift rides. Some resorts, you may have 2,000 vertical, and space to spread out your pacing isn't an issue. So kind of being aware of the resort that you're at, the ski area that you're at, and how you're going to be able to lay things out. But number one area I see shorted is this assessment criteria: not enough time to explore or play. Describing change. Our second assessment criteria under reflect and review is this is the instructor interaction piece of it. We want to help the students recognize and understand change in performance relative to outcomes. And this wording is really specific. It's not tell the students what they did. It's help students recognize and understand change in performance relative to their outcomes. So at a basic level, sometimes it is telling the students how they did. But at a bigger picture level, we want to be helping them understand how they can then recognize that in the future. So it's not just like, hey, that was great. It was, did you feel how your shins were pushing on the front of your boots more this time? And did you feel how that made a difference in your turn? Or what did you feel was different in this turn versus that last turn? Open-ended questions are always going to be better than closed questions with this, but guiding that reflection, helping them understand what changed in their performance and why what they did made a difference. And then relating change. And this is where our experience, our expertise as instructors is we're breaking, we know what they're back to assess and plan last month. We know what the end goal is. And we know we might not be getting to that end goal today or in this hour or in this 30-minute session. But what we want to do is connect the skills and drills we've been doing to that end goal. How do we apply a Wedge Christie drill that we've been hammering them on, trying to build those skills? How do we get them to understand how that's going to be different? How do we relate that change? This is why it's going to get better. This is why it's going to apply to your goals. And hopefully we're able to start to help them see those changes and see how that relates. So applying their gained skills to real situations, connecting the drills to real world application, provide strategies for self-practice, empower your students to integrate changes. We want to connect the skill from a drill directly to the terrain or the situation that they're seeking to improve in. We all know, maybe 1,000 steps isn't super fun, but it's a super effective drill. But if all we did was 1,000 steps all day and never connected that back to how that's actually improving their skiing towards their goal, we're falling short as an instructor. So going back to this list of LOs and ACs, I encourage you not to look at these as a checklist. I know I referenced those, and I'm so sorry I put that bottom one should be our reflect and review. I just pasted the wrong one in a second time. We'll jump back in these real quick. So we've got our assess and plan. We want to assess, collaborate, and plan our lesson. We move from there into adapt, our implement phase, adapt descriptions, demos, and feedback, and manage risk. And then into reflect and review, explore, experiment, and play, describe, change, and relate change. What I think can happen is we look at this list of 9 assessment criteria and we say, I've got to do step 1, I've got to do step 2, I've got to do step 3, get down here at the bottom. All right, I check, I explored, experimented, and played. Now I've got to describe that change. Hey, Greg, this is what you were doing. And now I got to relate change. Greg, this is how that applies to our outcome. And if we check all those boxes, we're going to be successful, right? Not necessarily. We want to look at these through the lens of the teaching and learning cycle. And just like in a real lesson, we want to give our little welcome and introduction. Hey, I'm Chris. I'm going to be your instructor today. And then the meat of our lesson is in this cycle. And I think, this teaching cycle was revamped and published in the Teaching Snow Sports Manual, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago. It used to have like 10 lines on it. It used to be a lot more complicated. It was simplified down, and Ellen Post Foster really drove cleaning up the teaching and learning cycle with the idea of welcome and introduction and review and preview. Those things happen, but they're kind of outside of the lesson. This is your meet and greet, and it's your lesson recap at the bottom of the run at the end of the day or the end of the lesson. Maybe it's with kids recapping to the parents, with the student maybe just reflecting and previewing what would happen in the next lesson. But those things are kind of outside the cycle. And then what's happening inside the cycle is this continual process. We assess our students and we determine goals and plan experiences. And that's kind of what the last month was focused on. From that, we're going to create experiences for learning. This is our starting to move into implementation and guiding practice. And that's really the heavy implementation piece. And where I would add reflect and review is then in between guide practice and assess students. So then we've spent some time practicing, and now we're assessing the students again. That's kind of our reflection time. We're taking what we've seen, and that starts a whole new loop. And that might happen on a single run. It might happen 8 times. Or it might happen, this cycle might happen once per run. Or maybe it happens every 2 to 3 runs. That's going to depend on you and your students in your real lesson. I think too, when I'm teaching in a private lesson, it looks very different. It looks very different in a private lesson where I've been working with a guest for years. It looks very different in a private lesson that's a one-on-one versus a 1-to-6, which is our max ratio at Vail Mountain. And it looks a heck of a lot different in group lessons, how this cycle works. And it looks very different from student to student. And so when we condense that, when we shrink that down into a 25 to 30 minute teaching cycle at an exam, it's going to look a little different too. But that doesn't mean it works any differently. What I want you to think about is taking a full day lesson with a student, picturing that lesson from last year. If you were to shrink that lesson down to one run, how would you work that cycle into that one run? Well, we're probably going to, we've got our assessment time. We've observed, it's kind of outside of your teaching segment. Some regions are using this already. Some regions will adopt it for next season, but you have this assess and observe time built into the first hour of the exam, where you're going to be skiing with your peers in the exam. You're going to be getting to know them. The examiner's probably going to prompt some questions, helping everyone start to get to know each other. You're going to have some time understanding what people's goals and motivations are within their own skiing. Obviously, everyone's goal at a level 2 exam is to pass my level 2 exam, but a little bit more granular than that, what are you working on in your skiing? What are some actual tangible things you're working on in your skiing? Starting to ask some of those questions of your peers. And then there's going to be some skiing tasks that are set up by the examiner, perhaps with some group feedback, some ideas that maybe you've heard some things in discussion. What do I want to see? And so we've got that observe and assess time right at the beginning of the exam. And then when you start your teach, in between that observe and assess time and when you actually teach, you've got determine goals and plan experiences. So, I was on the chair with a few of you, and I heard people really were stressed out about X, Y, or Z task, or people were maybe aware of their fore aft pressure, or they're working on directing pressure to the outside ski. I've got some tangible things, and I'm gonna help determine some goals and plan some experiences. From there, my actual teaching segment, I'm going to create some experiences for learning. That's probably going to be somewhere between 3 and 5 activities that I'm going to set up while I'm leading the group, that I can see you ski something, give some feedback, create some practice time, continually reassess, and build that teaching plan. I like to think about that plan as very much, it's in pencil. It's a plan. And it's going to change during my teach. As I'm teaching, it's going to change through that teaching scenario as I adapt to what's actually happening right in front of me. So it's really important here to remember that these assessment criteria and these learning outcomes, they aren't just line items on the assessment card. It's a constant cyclical process that we should be going throughout. I didn't do my assessment plan during that observation time and check that's done. That's a great way to set myself up for failure at the exam. It's a great way to set myself up for failure with a student. If I took information from you at the beginning of the day and 6 hours later, I haven't checked in on what your understanding is. I haven't asked you how you're understanding how your skiing's changed through the day. I haven't changed the drills or activities we're doing, even though you're mastering those. I haven't moved us to different terrain, or I haven't explored something new with you. I've stuck to one set of call down tasks and drills and haven't given you opportunity to practice or explore on your own. Those are all ways that I've set myself up for failure as your instructor. And similarly, those would be ways to set myself up for failure at an exam. So we don't want to look at these as individual checkboxes. Cool, check, I'm done. We want to look at it as a cycle. We want to be moving through that assessment form and through all these learning outcomes and assessment criteria continuously and throughout that entire time I'm teaching and that entire time I'm in front of the group. That loop is how we build better connections. It's how we anchor learning. It's how we continue to evolve the lesson and build it through that entire teach. So looking at it as an upward teaching spiral. We start with assess and plan. We move to implement, reflect and review. That leads us right into a new plan. And that's, again, like I was saying, this might happen once per run. This cycle, it might happen 5 times per run. In an exam scenario, it's probably going to happen 3 to 5 times during your teach. Hopefully, hope that it's going to happen 3 to 5 times within your teach, that you're going to continually move through these things as you work through skills and drills and adapt to what's happening directly in front of you. Recognizing that teaching is a continuous and evolving process, recognizing that each teaching cycle builds upon the previous one, that effective teaching leads to greater student learning, and the spiral model guides continuous improvement, that we're working through them one after another. It's not a checklist we move through once. We're constantly creating opportunities for reflection and review. That leads us into reassessing our group. That leads us into a new plan. So recapping this, implement and reflect and review. Implement is where your plan comes to life. It's the action-oriented part of your teaching. Reflect and review is where learning solidifies. It turns a good lesson into a great one by creating lasting change. Excelling here demonstrates your ability to create a student-centered, adaptive, and effective learning environment. So I want to take this, we've talked about a lot of these elements already, but really specifically exam application, because this is where, I feel like everyone goes out in front of a real guest and we click into guest mode. We click into guest service. We're going to meet whatever that guest needs are. And it's easy because it feels real, because it is real. And we get different questions from students than we do from our peers at an exam who are playing the role of our students. And the national proposal for the teaching system, this is in place in Rocky Mountain. I believe most regions have adopted some format of this, and we are looking at alignment as of April of 2026, which means next season, the 26-27 season, things should look a lot more alike than different across all regions. It'll be a 25 to 30-minute teaching scenario with a real life teach that you've built out of that roughly 45 minutes to an hour of observation time before anyone teaches. You're going to go out with a group. You're going to ski a run or two, depending on the vertical, depending on the mountain, with some activities selected by the examiner, possibly with some feedback from the group in terms of tasks they'd really like to see their peers ski. That 25 to 30 minutes, those of you that have taught in New Zealand or in other countries may have experienced short lessons. I know a few resorts in the US still offer 1 hour private lessons. It's not as common as it used to be, but certainly if you've taught in the Southern Hemisphere, you're pretty used to this roughly 1 hour lesson, which means 30 to 40 minutes of actual teaching time. I find that anything that you can do to make the exam feel real helps with creating a scenario where you're going to be successful. And so framing this as, okay, I've got some observation time that doesn't really count as my 25 to 30 minutes of teaching, but that's kind of part of it. So really it's about a 45 minutes total if I were to stick that into a real lesson. And meet my students and greet, that takes 5 minutes or so, and wrapping up at the end of the lesson, because I then got to get to my next lesson, which is another 1 hour lesson. That's going to take 5 minutes or so. So yeah, I've probably got about 40 minutes of real teaching in a 1 hour private. It starts to make that exam scenario feel a little bit more real. I like to think about that as 4 5-minute sections with a little wiggle room. So if I personally have a hard time picturing, okay, what am I going to do for the next 30 minutes? But if I break that into 4 different things that I'm going to teach, 4 segments of my teach, in each of those, I have about 5 minutes. Okay, that's 20 minutes. And then I've got a little bit of wiggle room. So if I talked a little bit too much, or if a student didn't understand and I needed to re-explain, or that activity just fell flat on its face and I didn't get anything valuable out of it, the students didn't get anything valuable out of it, I'm going to reset and redo that with something different. So if I think about it as 4 5-minute sections, I find that really helpful for how I can build a progression to fill a 30-minute teach. Again, it leaves some wiggle room. I know 4 times 5 doesn't equal 30, but it gives me some wiggle room, some balance on either side. Sometimes that might be 5 segments. Sometimes it might be 3, depending on what you're teaching, depending on how quickly your students are picking up the drills. But it gives me a good starting point. And then start from the finish. I find it, again, I have a hard time kind of trying to frame out what that entire 30-minute teach is going to look like. But I find it a lot easier to think about based on the conversations I've had with my peers, with my students. What do I want to be doing at the end of that 30 minutes? And so I find it much easier to build a progression starting from the end, starting from the reflect and review. When I get to the end of the lesson and we're reflecting and reviewing what we did, where do I want us to be? And so if at the level 2, my students are skiing, my peers are struggling with being a little bit aft in the bumps. Well, my goal is probably at the end of this 30 minutes, hopefully, they're skiing a little bit more centered, maybe a little bit more pressure over the ball of their foot, and they're making a little bit rounder turns and being able to ski those bumps a little bit more comfortably. So that's where I want to be at the end of my 30 minutes. And I've probably got a couple minutes to reflect and review there at the end. So what do I want to be doing before that? Well, I probably want them exploring and creating their own line. I kind of want to be in that free application portion of applying skills for the 5 minutes before that. So if I want them exploring and applying my skills and drills, what are my skills and drills that are going to get them to there? So I'm kind of working backwards from the end of that lesson. Here's my concrete nugget. In order to do that, I need them to be applying that skill for the 5 minutes before that. But then the 5 minutes before that needs to be a kind of more in that complex zone, putting a couple of variables together. And if that's my goal there, then I need to work back to a simple drill. That how's that simple drill going to help build into that complex? It's going to build into that application, that free ski, and that's going to build into my reflect and review that got me there. And so for me, this is a tool I use anytime I'm doing a demo teach, or 3 years ago when I did my Alpine 2 teach, I started from the end and worked my way towards the front. Okay, so that gives me this frame of reference where I'm going to start that teach. And that was all built on the observations and the conversations I had before starting that teach. Another piece, exam application, 2/3 of your time should be doing. Practice time. I probably harped on that quite a bit earlier, but it's the number one thing that I see go wrong at exams is 2/3 of the time is talking and less than 1/3 of the time is skiing. We want to swap that order. 2/3 of our time should be the student doing things. And so of those 4 5-minute sections, that means 3+ minutes of each of those sections should be them skiing. That gives me a minute to set up a task and a minute to wrap up a task. And again, I've got some wiggle room there. So maybe it's 2 minutes to set up and maybe it's 2 minutes to break down. And it was 4 minutes of actual skiing, that practice time. But try to think of each of those 5-minute blocks as 3 minutes of that is skiing and 2 minutes or less of it is our talking time, which rolls right into that next bullet point. Don't over-explain. It's so easy. And what I find when I find myself re-explaining something in front of a group, that tells me I probably wasn't clear enough the first time I set it up. And so what are other ways that we can go back and circle back to that content? One would be ask the group, hey, well, in your words, tell me what we're going to be doing here. So just finding a way to cut myself up and get my students, hey, I set up a task. I explained it once already. Can you tell me what we're going to be doing here? Find a way to circle that back and the check for understanding is super valuable, but I find often we check for understanding, we get some vague answers, and we try to re-explain it again. If you're getting that glazed look, or the students are clearly, your peer students are clearly not understanding the task that you set up, find another way to explain it. Maybe focus on the demo, get the group moving, but try not to just verbally re-explain it a second or a third or a fourth time, because that's the time sink just starts going. Mentioned this earlier, feedback does not have to be a verbal call down. Just because this is what examiners do on ski day, we've got 8 candidates that we're scoring. We're making notes about people skiing and riding. We're trying to collect all that feedback. We're assessing everyone. We do a lot of call down tasks on the ski day. I think sometimes we get the impression that because that's how examiners evaluate on ski day, that's how we should set up tasks that we're having students do on our teach day. Remember other ways that we can give feedback. Feedback could be reciprocal. I could set up a task where we're skiing in partners, and you're giving each other feedback during that ski segment. So I want you calling out fore and aft as you see your partner moving on their skis. So I want you moving forward at the initiation of your turn, back to center in the shaping, and maybe just a little bit towards the tail and the finish. And I want your partner to call out when they see you move fore, center, aft, something like that, where they're giving each other feedback during that. Now at the end of that segment, in the reflection of that teaching segment, you can have them share their thoughts versus you having to say, okay, Greg, I saw this. Okay, Bruce, I saw this, right? And that time, that feedback time, sometimes super valuable, but you don't have to do it on every task, on every run, on every piece of your teaching segment. It just eats time. And looking at that 2/3 of your time should be doing, if we're giving individualized verbal feedback on every task, you're going to skew towards the talking time. It's impossible in a 30-minute teach to give verbal feedback on every single task to every student. And then finally, again, continually reflect, assess, and apply to create a new plan. This is the teaching cycle. This is the upward spiral. We are reflecting on what we did. we're using that assessment and applying it to create a new plan, and we implement that new plan. So it should be continually revisiting it throughout our teaching segment. Additional resources, the Teaching Snow Sports Manual, the Teaching Children Snow Sports Manual. Those both are in the last 10 years. If you are a member in good standing, you have access to both of those for free in the digital manuals on the PSIA-AASI website. So that's the snowpros.org under education, free digital books. You can log in with your member profile, access those books. Great resources in there to dive into more. The PSIA-AASI certification standards and performance guides. If you haven't been on the national website in the last year, it is a new website. It's quite a bit easier to navigate, but that link, I can, how do I post that into the chat? The learning outcomes and assessment criteria I referenced in this presentation were for the level 2. Obviously, they are different for the level 1. They're tiered down a little bit, and they're tiered up at the level 3. Finally, the All I Really Need to Know I Learned from Snowboarding, but Don't Worry, It Applies to Skiing Too podcast with PSIA-AASI team members, myself, Matt Larson, and Brian Donovan. That QR code goes to it, but I'll post that link in the chat as well. We talk about quite a bit about certification along with teaching skills, people skills, and everything else. And you guys are welcome to reference that. Feel free to grab my email address here, Instagram, my YouTube. If you want to connect with me, I'm always happy to chat more skiing, snowboarding, teaching, whatever. I'm happy to be a resource anytime, regardless of discipline. And I find I learn just as much from these conversations as I have to share. If you haven't already, please do fill out the clinic attendance form. Thank you, Jen, for posting that multiple times tonight. I'll put it in here one more time. And that is the content for the presentation. And I'm happy to answer some questions and chat. If you have questions, want to discuss elements more, feel free to take yourself off mute and jump in, or throw a chat in the chat if you don't want to unmute. But kind of framing out, looking at overall this idea of implement and reflect and review being the action plan. This is taking the plan into action. This is our doing. This is our practice time. This is our exploration, experimentation, and play. In case you came on late, I did mention at the beginning, there are new assessment criteria, and we don't know if those are going to be put into effect this year or for the 26-27 season. Some regions may be adopting them this year. Some regions may wait. There is not a drastic change in the overall content. Things were clarified, made more concise and condensed into two assessment criteria per learning outcome. So a total of 6 assessment criteria, where there are currently a total of 9. It does not change what we are working on. It doesn't change the fundamentals. It doesn't change our goal to be great instructors. It really won't change the overall experience at an exam, but it does condense and make things a little bit more concise. And I just want everyone to be aware that those will be changing at some point. The content's all there. Jen Metz has been super involved in that project. Ellen Post-Foster has been involved from Rocky. It's the National Teaching Task Force is made up of leaders from all over the country, working to make those just a little bit more digestible and understandable. So again, just a heads up that change is coming, but isn't being applied yet. Next week will be Chris Caruso jumping in. There will be opportunity for clarification on tonight's presentation. So if you have questions you don't feel like asking tonight, or as you're noodling things through the week, feel free to write your questions down and come next week ready to get more clarification. And then the following week will be more application. And then the 4th week is practice time. So it'll be kind of continuing with these concepts, moving into more and more real application as we go. Goal for tonight was getting a baseline understanding of what those learning outcomes are, trying to put them in outside, like taking them from that language of academia and putting them into like, this is what we actually do. This is what these things look like when we're out teaching, whether we're teaching skiing, snowboarding, pickleball, badminton, I don't know, whatever else you teach. These are the things that make teaching real, how we connect with our students in the learning environment. Thank you all for making time and spending your Wednesday evening with me. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with y'all. I'll stick around for a few more minutes. If anyone does have questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, feel free to enjoy the rest of your Wednesday evening.